Welcome to Indie Beacon Radio, where creative souls can find help in marketing their creations. You can send questions for each show on Twitter using the hashtag IndieBeacon. Now sit back and enjoy learning about our guest for this show.
Welcome to today's show of Indie Beacon Radio. Today I have with me Kimberly Fish, who has written a couple of different books. She's got one new one and one old one. Let's start with the old one. Excuse me. Get a little cough there. Harm General is the name of the book. You won some awards and reviews on it. So let's start with that. What's it about?
Well, Harm General is really a fascinating story, a spy narrative that talks about the World War II contributions that Texas made during the war effort, and particularly in how U.S. Army hospitals were able to develop the life-saving medicines that we take for granted today, but what were so critical for the troops fighting in Europe and in the Pacific. So specifically, the book Harm General details the fight for malaria treatments. And when I was doing my research, I realized that the malaria treatments were so horrendous for soldiers who were trying to take the preventative medicines. They really just preferred not to even go for that and took their risks getting into the Pacific with the mosquitoes. But the reality was it was devastating to our troops. And so Harm General Hospital, a U.S. Army hospital that popped up during World War II, located in East Texas, was instrumental in developing those malaria treatments and helping to save our troops. And I feel like that was a story worth telling.
Now, this really isn't so much about a non-fictional aspect. If I remember correctly, it has some fictional touches to it. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. I went with a historical fiction route to tell these stories because I felt like it was important to recreate the elements of the era. And I didn't want to try to position myself as a historian of, absolute record. What I wanted to do was tell a really compelling story to a modern generation in a format that they would find pleasurable and recreate what the world was like back when our grandfathers and our grandmothers were figuring out how they were going to navigate World War II. And so thankfully, readers have really responded positively to these novels. And I've had a lot of great feedback that they love learning what the past generations did and kind of seeing how that all plays out in our world today.
Now, if I understand correctly, you have a female spy in the book. How does that relate to the storyline that you just said?
Well, so it's crazy. When we were talking about World War II and kind of replaying what some of the elements were that went into that backstory, I discovered that this emerging spy network that kind of came out of World War II was so definitive for our success, but it really relied on an odd group of people to pull it together. And so if you'll bear with me, I'll just kind of set the stage for you. Churchill and Roosevelt were putting their heads together on how to develop the spy network. And the British already had a very effective spy network that we commonly know of as the SOE. It was the front runner for what we know of as MI6 and that sort of thing. But the United States had nothing like that. And so in fighting an enemy that we'd never fought before, creating a spy network became critical to the success of the missions that our troops were going on. Well, so many of our troops had been drafted to serve in World War II that finding the next tier of available volunteers was a little tricky. And so what they did was they recruited a lot of con artists, that had a light sentence to be spies. They also convinced a lot of young women, particularly women in those East Coast schools that were fluent in foreign languages, French, maybe had an interest in serving in Europe, maybe had some past experiences navigating Europe. And they drafted them. They sold them this line about serve your country, see the world, do daring things. And the reality was so many of those young women that took up the mission of what the United States was calling the Office of Strategic Services walked into some pretty horrendous scenarios. And so my main character in the Big Inch novel is one of those spies. She's reassigned to Texas to recover from a pretty botched mission that happened in France. And she's been given what they presume to be a lighter assignment. And so she is involved in the Big Inch Pipeline Project, which is the premise of book one. And then the second book, Harmon General, continues her narrative and also brings in another female spy and shows how useful women and minorities were in our American home front.
Now, Fort Hood is one of the largest Army bases in the United States, and it's here in Texas. But what was your reasoning for putting this into Texas?
Well, my backstory is I've been a professional freelance writer for about 30 years. And in the course of compiling the 100-year history for the Longview Chamber of Commerce, a project that I was hired to do, I came across these two really amazing World War II stories that happened right here in this town where I live. And the interesting thing was nobody really seemed to talk about that. And they were fairly heroic projects. I mean, the Big Inch Pipeline Project got Texas oil to the troops fighting in Europe and was able to empower all those vehicles and planes and ships and tanks that allowed our troops to win. And it was a crazy big idea that probably should never have worked against all odds, but it did work and it helped win the war. And when I discovered that that was something we needed to hang our hat on and learn more about, well, that's what prompted me to write the first book. But that was not the only World War II project in this area, which led to the Harmon General novel following it. And so it's really fascinating when you discover how much of a role Texas played in World War II and how quick our state was to respond to the needs of World War II. Through the military and a lot of civilian agencies.
I'm actually quite surprised at how well Texas played in the Civil War as well and stuff, was things that I never thought were going on and stuff. But for you, granted, and thankfully World War II is a little closer to our timeline, how was the research done for that?
So I really had some interesting channels to go through to get the research. I'm an active participant in our local historical museum, and so I spent a lot of time digging through some pretty dusty files there. Spent a lot of time in the library researching old newspaper archives. But I also went on the road. I went to several area museums. There's a really fantastic museum at LaTourneau University. I went to Shreveport to the University of Louisiana library and archives there. I went down to San Antonio to the U.S. Army Medical Museum. And then I spent countless hours at the World War II Museum in New Orleans doing research. And one of the interesting things I found is there's just not a big paper trail for a lot of the things that happened in World War II. And I think a lot of that is so much was being just sort of invented on the fly. I mean, historians will look back and tell you that the United States really had no interest in getting into World War II. And it wasn't until, Pearl Harbor sort of forced our hand that we had to fly into all of that. But thanks to some really visionary military leaders, there was already strategies in place for that should the eventuality happen. And Texas was ready to serve their country. And we really have quite an interesting story to tell about what Texas contributed from an economic standpoint, all of the machinery and industry that was created here, and then went on to become really the backbone of our modern Texas economy system. And then also the role we played with the military, not only in taking care of active duty through training and medical facilities, but we had a significant number of German POW camps here in Texas during World War II. And that's its own unique story. So really there's a lot of rich material. You just have to look for it.
So that sounds like you've got enough material to start working on book number 3, 4, and 5. Are you doing that?
I am, because what's interesting about the Big Inch Pipeline story, telling that story of how the oil really was so critical to getting to the troops and the backstory of that, and then Harmon General telling the story of the role the U.S. Army hospital systems played in Texas was really important. But I think the story that people are drawn to, at least that I hear when I get feedback as I take the books out to speak, is they want to know more about that human element. Tell us more about what the soldiers' lives were like. Tell us more about what the home front was like. And tell us about those German POWs. How did they get to Texas? What did they do while they were here? And how many of them really wanted to stay at the end of the war? So there is a lot of material, and I am working on a third book.
Now, in reference to, well, there's so many ways I can go with this, so I'm going to try to keep it short. But for Harmon General, what happened to that hospital?
Well, there's a fantastic second chapter. So let me just sort of describe the setting for you. Back in the days when the Army was planning out where they were going to place their military hospitals, and it was very strategic what they had in mind. Along the coastlines of the United States, they were going to make the really emergent hospital systems for soldiers to be shipped there and then returned to battle. And then they found these areas in the middle of our country that were ideal for long-term wounded, places that would be safe, places that families could get to visit their soldiers, and places that could be converted should we have an emergent need to defend ourselves from a Nazi invasion. And just to be clear, they really did intend to defend our country through the Texas southern border, because there was a full belief that the Nazis were going to invade through Mexico, which is why we have so many hospital and military facilities there around that San Antonio area. But East Texas was chosen because of its transportation grid, very easy to get people and families in and out of this area. And it was so remote that nobody was going to be able to escape, for instance, the German POWs. There were 2 POW camps in this area, and the trustees of those POW camps were put to work in the East Texas area. And the beautiful thing is they weren't going very far. I mean, even if they escaped their compounds, there really was no place for them to go to get back to Germany. So they were well and good and stuck. But the beautiful part of that story is Texas and Texans responded so graciously to a very difficult situation. And I think they treated everybody with kindness, which was rather remarkable for that era.
So it brings up a couple questions, one being the fact of the POW camps, which again, that sounds like a whole different book in itself. But also then I've heard rumors that there were German U-boats and things, submarines, that did come along the coast of South Texas and stuff. Do you know if any of that is true?
I do, actually. And really, that was one of the reasons why the Big Inch Pipeline had to be built in the first place. So back in that time, in the early 40s, Texas was supplying a lot of oil to the northeastern United States. And they were sending them out on major tankers, leaving the Houston shipping channel. Well, as the Nazis were preparing to engage the United States, they were sending in their U-boats to the Gulf of Mexico. And they were pretty much systematically sinking every ship that left the Houston shipping channel, not only with our oil, but with other supplies that were destined for the troops. And I think statistics indicate there's like 159 tankers that were sunk in the Gulf. And so when that happened, Roosevelt knew that there had to be some other way to get oil from Texas to the northern United States and onto the troops in Europe. And he assembled this unlikely cast of characters, oil men, both from the national organizations and independent wildcatters, who had absolutely no reason to want to work with the federal government based on their past history. But he brought those people together and said, our country is facing a huge problem. How can you help us solve it? And their answer was this strange for its time solution. And that was this above ground, massive pipeline project that was 2 feet around in circle, an inch thick with steel. And it had to be cobbled together with recycled materials and a minority workforce made up of women and minorities who had to be trained in welding, because all of our trained welders were already working in the factories building those airplanes and trains and tanks. And oh my goodness, the fact that that started in Longview, Texas, and went all the way to New Jersey, and it was built in 14 months. Well, I don't know about where you live, Alan, but where I live, we can't even get a road paved in 14 months. So the pipeline to take that oil to the troops is really a fantastic story about what will of the people is in a time of crisis and the things that we're willing to overcome. And so that was the genesis of that Big Inch story, and bringing the spy in to that time period was sort of my fish out of water view on what life was like here in East Texas, because those are some pretty crazy days here, and with a lot of wealth flowing from the oil field discoveries of the 30s. It was a wild and crazy area. So it was a fun story to write, and fascinating to hear people's reaction to it.
Yeah, it definitely does sound quite fascinating. And I've heard many stories as far as the wildcats and the 30s and the oil industry in Texas and stuff. So I'm sure you have plenty to choose from as far as doing something.
Yeah.
We're going to take a short break and listen to our sponsors, and then we'll be right back.
I am Grace Allison Blair, an award-winning author, motivational speaker, and modern mystic. I have combined spiritual and psychological principles in my nonfiction self-help books under Grace Allison and fiction books under Grace Blair. Go to modernmysticmedia.com to find Do You Have a Dream? 5 Keys to Realize Your Dream, and my novel, Einstein's Compass, a YA time traveler adventure.
Love to read? Love to meet authors in person? Then check out bookfestival.network to find a book festival in your region of Texas. We are adding book festival events throughout the year, so sign up to get notices and even a coupon towards purchase of a Texas author's book. Sign up at bookfestival.network.
The war has ended, but the memory lingers on. Has been written by Helen Munday and Christian Gutling. A story of a Dutch secret agent under German occupation, highlighted drama, and then the British rescuing him and teaching him how to navigate the Fairey Swordfish airplane. This book can be purchased on Amazon and Barnes & Nobles, written by Helen Munday and Christian Gutling.
Welcome back to Indie Beacon Radio. Don't forget to like us, follow us, or subscribe to one of our many channels. Now, here is your host for today's show.
All righty, we are back, and I am B. Alan Bourgeois, your host for today's show. We have Kimberly Fish with us. We've been talking about her 2 books, her latest one, Herman General, and then the first one, yes, if you want to hold them up while you've got them there, there's Herman General and the Big Inch Pipe.
Just called the Big Inch.
The Big Inch. My
Big Inch
apologies.
and Herman General. Easy to remember.
So with something you mentioned earlier, and I want to touch briefly on that, Texas was settled a lot by Germans. So to have POW camps here of Germans, even though it was on the East Texas side, not as centered more where the Germans settled in the Central Texas area, but there's got to be a lot of interesting stories, both for the inmates as well as the people who live in Texas that were German descent. So there must have been a lot of material to find and stories to be told in that aspect, was there?
Well, it's funny. I think it just kind of goes back to that whole World War II era where things were flying so fast. But my indications are, and I do know a lot about the German migration to Texas and the forming of the Hill Country area and the settling in the San Antonio. That actually is very much a part of my 3rd novel, which is called Comfort Plans, which is set in the Texas Hill Country. But I know that storyline. I know some of the history around that. So it was surprising to me that there wasn't more of a mix between our pre-established German communities in Texas and the POW camps. But to be fair, they did put the POW camps in some fairly remote locations. And one of the little bits of research that I found indicated that the first Texas community that sort of lobbied to get a POW camp was in Hearne, Texas. And part of that was, and I guess their strategy was thinking, well, we can use these prisoners to work in our fields. And they did. And so it just became sort of its own campus, because there were some real, I don't want to misplay this, there were some fractious goings on in those POW camps. I mean, some of the POWs that were brought were from North Africa, the ones that were brought to Texas. And we had some pretty hardcore Nazi soldiers in those POW camps. And then we had some soldiers who were less hardcore and more empathetic to just getting out and working. And so I'm sure there was an own complicated culture within that POW camp mix. But truthfully, I've not found just tons of research. And I haven't even found a lot of anecdotal research, because I think what happened was, and I'm just presuming, I'm a fiction writer and I tend to do this, is that once the war was declared over and the German soldiers were sent back to their home country, and they got to Germany and they saw just the disaster that was their home country, I think those that had a taste of America might have applied to re-immigrate to our country. And when they got back to the United States as a civilian, I think they wanted no prior claim to having been a part of that German machinery that was Hitler's army. And so they just wanted to blend in and kind of disappear. And that may be why there's not a lot of material, at least none that I found, documenting what a lot of those soldiers went through in their POW camps. I think they just wanted to move forward. And anyway, there may be more research. I haven't found it, but that's what I've got so far. And I thought it was interesting, in the book Harmon General, I actually refer to how some of the German POWs were used as orderlies at the hospital, treating the soldiers. And I just think, what a strange dynamic that must have been, to be a soldier lying in a hospital bed with an amputation or some sort of horrendous condition brought on by battle, and hearing a German accent from your orderly. And I have to think that created its own complex dynamics in those recovery wards. But that's not what my book's about. That's just a bonus. But I have to think that that was its own really complicated process. And you know, it's just part of a story that's probably going to be lost to us as we go forward.
Yeah, I can fully understand that. Doing research of Texas prisons, it almost sounds exactly the same as the POW. You have your inner life going on and different hierarchies going on, and it sounds just the same as that POW camp in that respect as well. I'm curious, with all the research that you have done, are any physical locations still visible of the different things, the hospitals, the pipelines, any of that stuff?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, that's one of the reasons why it's so much fun to be able to tell these stories of these books. I speak often at Rotary clubs and civic clubs and service clubs because there are still signs of these fantastic projects. And with the Big Inch pipeline, the head of that is still an active pipeline project in Longview. There's a historical marker. And parts of the pipeline project are still in place today. What was so interesting about that pipeline is they invented the technology to move crude oil uphill and across mountain chains in the Mississippi River. And that same hydraulic technology that they invented, well, that's the standard for pipeline projects today. And so the fact that it's still working almost 75, 80 years later, that just speaks to the craftsmanship that went into these things all those years ago. So yes, parts of the Big Inch pipeline are still in use. They're highly visible. And there'll be a lot more probably emphasis on that as we come into these World War II commemoratives coming down the road. And then at Harmon General, one of the interesting things I did was I set a very pivotal, and I'll be frank, unholy scene in the chapel that was at Harmon General campus when this was a military hospital. You'd asked me earlier a little bit about this. And the Army bought 155 acres of a farm in East Texas to set this project on. And it looked exactly like every other military hospital unit anywhere else in Texas, or really the United States, because they all looked the same. And there were all these different elements. There was 220 active buildings on this campus. And it was built in, seemingly overnight, because everything was prefab. But the chapel on this property is still there. Because after the end of World War II, when an industrialist was being recruited to come to Longview, his name was R.G. Letourneau, and he and his wife were being courted, to bring a big industrial plant here. And they saw the barracks of Harmon General. It had been evacuated after World War II and just kind of left freestanding. And they had a desire to build a Christian institution of training to help GIs reacclimate to industrial America after the war and give them a life skill that they could then work, find a good paying job. And so they made a deal with the area, and they said, if we can get you that property that Harmon General is on, would you bring your industrial plant to Longview, Texas? And R.G. Letourneau said, well, yes. So they brought their massive industrial plant to Longview, Texas, which went on to become one of the leading producers of earth-moving equipment in the world. And they bought Harmon General Hospital and turned that into what is known today as Letourneau University, one of the 50 leading universities in what we call STEAM academics. And it's really kind of having this fantastic second chapter. It was changing lives as a military hospital, and it's changing lives as this dynamic polytechnic university, and all from 155 acres. And on that property, the chapel still exists from World War II. And so that's really why I set my scene in that, because I wanted people, when they went on campus, to kind of find the ghosts of Harmon General. I wanted them to end up in that chapel.
That sounds exciting and really quite interesting to be able to go in and not only visualize what you're writing about, but also the history that was there and stuff like that. We're going to step away for our last set of commercials or from our sponsors, and we'll be right back.
What would you do if you found out everyone on the town council were thieves and murderers? That's what happened in Bandera, Texas in 1873. John Cruder was the marshal, yet he needed to operate outside the law in order to balance the scales of justice. He is the Midnight Marauder. You can find his books on Amazon.com and TopWesterns.com in paperback, digital, and audio. I'm Roy Clinton, and I hope you'll read The Midnight Marauder.
Indie Lector is a store for serious readers and indie authors. Find great talent at indielector.store and save money on books with their book club. A portion of the proceeds helps get books into schools and libraries in need. Find a great book to read by an indie author at indielector.store.
What started as a love letter to her son has become an international love letter for all parents to their children. Now you can read acclaimed author Shanalee Charbonneau's story to your children. When her son was very sick, she calmed him by singing her own song to him. She turned that song into the book, My Mama Loves Me, I'm Her Little Boy. She wrote 3 more magical books for all parents and kids 6 and under. Available at Indie Lector, Amazon.
And we are back. This is your host, and there I am, B. Alan Bourgeois. We have with us Kimberly Fish, who is a writer for 2 different specific books about historical fiction of World War II. You have probably 2 or 3 more getting ready to be written over the course of the next few years with all her research. Being a researcher for a historical fiction is slightly different, but not too different from doing regular nonfiction. What challenges did you run into that you would want to share with somebody else on how to better be a researcher or a better writer for what they do?
Well, thanks, Alan. That's really an important question, because one of the, I think the tricky things about writing historical fiction is getting the era right. We as modern residents of this very sophisticated world that we live in have a hard time sometimes putting on the hat of a different era and getting into the mind of what it would have been like to live in that time period and navigate the waters without the benefit of our 21st century thinking. And so that was a real challenge for me, because I've enjoyed a lot of adventures in my life, and I wanted to pull a lot of that into my characters as I was writing these, strong, bold women. And then I realized in the 1940s, being a woman was a completely different experience than what I have ever known. So getting that mindset correct and authentic, being genuine to the struggles of an era and the growth process that somebody would have been going through during that was both a challenge and a satisfying experience for me, because it gave me an opportunity to give homage to people who had to overcome, horrific, really, living conditions from what we know of. I mean, just looking at the racial tensions alone in the 30s and 40s was just far and away different from anything you or I would know. And then anything that involves women trying to kind of get outside of their pre-established boxes was radical. And a young female spy who left a farming community to go to Europe and be a spy, and then has to come back and try to reacclimate to the expectations of society at that time. Well, that was just a little nuts. And so I had to put myself in those shoes and walk those steps. And I did it respectfully. And I think that's one of the things that's really important about writing historical fiction, is that we can't presuppose our own mindset on our characters in a bygone era. We just have to equip them the best they can to navigate and make their journey feel authentic.
So people who want to find either of your two books, where can they find you? Where can they purchase the books? How can they reach out to you?
Well, I love to stay in touch with folks. So I have a great website where I would invite people to visit. It's www.kimberlyfish.com. I have a free little novella that I give to folks who subscribe to my very sporadic newsletters. There's a spot where they can drop in their email and receive that. There's also, you can buy the books there. The Big Inch is available as a paperback, an audio book, and an ebook. And then the other books are both available as paperback and ebook as well. And there's a great little trailer on there for the books. So a lot of fun things are on my website. That's a great place to connect. And then they can also follow me on Facebook. I have an author page, Kimberly Fish, author. I do a lot of interaction with readers there. And then I love to be on Instagram. I just really, I love that picture. Picture tells 1,000 words. And I frequently post places that I've been, folks I've met, and just the life I feel blessed to live. So I would love to connect with folks there.
I was actually wondering about Instagram, if you were there, simply because of all the historical researching that you've done. You probably come across a lot of old imagery, blueprints, who knows what, that would be a great thing to be putting out there on Instagram, sharing the information, also promoting what you're doing at the same time.
Yeah, I really have. I've been fortunate to inherit a bunch of old maps, old photographs, letters. Folks are really entrusted with me a lot of their personal keepsakes that really give, I think, authenticity to this story. And I'm really getting to turn a lot of that back as a gift to my community, because I'm involved in, our city's about to have their 150th birthday. And so I'll be involved in a lot of that, kind of telling the story of us to the people of Longview. And so I'm really looking forward to doing that and being a part of that. And just kind of telling the amazing things that our grandparents were able to accomplish under a time of crisis, and hope that inspires us should we ever be in a situation where we're first forced to do things we never dreamed we could, just to know that there's a fine example we can follow. We will survive, and we'll be able to do it too.
Well, I thank you very much for being with us. This has been Kimberly Fish. She has her book, The Big Inch, and Herman General, two historical fiction books about World War II in Texas, plus much more that are quite interesting stories. So I hope you will go out and purchase them. Thank you again for watching, and thank you again, Kimberly, for being with us.
Thanks, Alan. I sure enjoyed the conversation. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Indie Beacon Radio, where creative souls can find help in marketing their creations. To learn more about Indie Beacon services, to be a guest on the show, or to advertise on our show, please visit our website at indiebeacon.com.